Not everyone in Florida is benefiting from the new property tax changes. In fact, these reforms are quietly drawing a clear line between cities that help older residents stay and cities that push them out faster. In some places, people who paid off their homes years ago are finally breathing easier and choosing to stay a little longer. In others, even after the law changed, the sense of uncertainty never really went away. That is the uncomfortable truth. The same state, the same policy, but completely different outcomes depending on where you live. And for many retirees, this is no longer a political debate or a policy discussion. It is a very personal question. Am I still allowed to grow old in the home I worked my whole life to keep? Number 1, Sarasota. In Sarasota, something subtle is happening that is leaving many older residents feeling relieved and at the same time a little cautious. After the new property tax adjustments took effect, there were no celebrations, no bold promises from city leaders. Instead, the change showed up in a quieter way. People stopped preparing to leave. And that moment, more than anything else, is how you know Sarasota has truly shifted. For years, many retirees in Sarasota never thought about moving until they were forced to. Their homes were long paid off. Life felt settled. But every year, the property tax bill crept up a little more. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to plant a dangerous question in the back of their minds. If this keeps going, how long can I really hold on? Sarasota was still a beautiful place to retire, but it no longer felt like a safe place to grow old. When the new tax rules began to take hold, especially protections tied to homestead properties and long-term homeowners, the first thing that changed was not home prices. It was behavior. Homes that had been quietly listed just in case disappeared from the market. Plans to downsize were put on hold. People started thinking about staying a few more years instead of mapping out an exit. But this is also where a new tension emerged because this tax relief does not help everyone the same way. The biggest beneficiaries are longtime homeowners living on fixed incomes who are still able to hold on. But what about those who moved here more recently or those who were already forced to sell before the changes came for them? That sense of security may already be out of reach. That created an invisible line inside Sarasota. On one side are residents who feel they were saved just in time. On the other are those wondering if they arrived a few years too late. The new tax law has not just changed numbers on a bill. It is quietly redefining who can realistically stay in the city for the long haul. Sarasota has not just managed to keep its older residents, it has managed to preserve its community fabric. Longtime neighbors are still there. Volunteer networks remain intact. Health care and senior services have not been disrupted by a mass exodus, but this stability comes with an unavoidable question. If the city is collecting less in property taxes, where does that revenue get replaced? Higher service fees, budget cuts, or pressure shifted onto other groups like renters or younger families. That is what makes Sarasota such a revealing case. It shows that new property tax laws can slow the quiet push out of older residents, but they do not erase every pressure. They do not solve everything. They simply change priorities, and for many retirees, that alone can be a life-changing difference. Sarasota's story is not just about a city that benefited. It is an open question for all of Florida. If tax policy can help seniors stay here, why is not that happening everywhere? And more importantly, if you live in a city that has not changed this way yet, how long before you realize which side of that line you are on? Sarasota has bought people time. The question is whether that time will be used to truly stay or just to delay a harder decision down the road. And that is something even those benefiting from the new tax laws still do not know how to answer. Number 2, Cape Coral. What happens when you have done everything right, paid off your home, lived within your means, and the city you retired to slowly becomes harder to afford anyway? That question has been quietly shaping life in Cape Coral for years. And after the new property tax changes took effect, the answer did not come as a celebration. It came as a pause. Cape Coral has long been a magnet for middle-class retirees. Not flashy, not luxury-driven, but practical. People moved here because it felt manageable. Homes were affordable. Life was predictable. But predictability started to erode when property taxes kept climbing year after year, even as income stayed flat. For many older homeowners, the fear was not sudden eviction. It was something more unsettling. The slow realization that staying put might no longer be sustainable. Before the tax changes, Cape Coral developed a pattern that rarely made headlines. Homes would quietly go up for sale. Not because owners wanted to leave, but because they were afraid of waiting too long. Couples downsized earlier than planned. Repairs were postponed. People began treating their homes less like a permanent place and more like a temporary holding point. Cape Coral was not pushing people out loudly. It was wearing them down. When the new property tax adjustments came through, especially those protecting homestead properties and long-term homeowners. The city did not transform overnight. Prices did not drop, costs did not disappear, but something important shifted. The urgency to leave slowed down. The fear that next year's tax bill would be the breaking point eased just enough for people to breathe again. The most noticeable change was not in the market, but in mindset. Realtors began seeing fewer preemptive listings. Homeowners who had been on the edge decided to wait. Some even started putting money back into their homes, something they had not felt safe doing before. In Cape Coral, staying became a reasonable option again, not a gamble. But unlike Sarasota, Cape Coral's story carries a sharper edge. This city is filled with retirees who are not wealthy, just careful. The tax relief helped them stay afloat, but it also exposed a new divide. Those who already owned homes benefited the most. Those who arrived later or those renting, while hoping to buy, did not see the same relief. For them, the city still feels just as tight as before. That tension matters because Cape Coral's stability depends on balance. If the city protects longtime homeowners but shifts costs elsewhere through fees, services, or future assessments, the pressure does not disappear. It moves. And many residents are starting to ask where it will land next. What makes Cape Coral significant is not that it became cheaper. It did not. What changed is that it became temporarily survivable for people who were close to being pushed out. The new tax laws did not solve the retirement affordability problem. They slowed the clock. And for a city full of older Americans living on fixed incomes, time is the most valuable thing there is. Cape Coral today sits in a fragile middle ground. It is no longer bleeding retirees the way it once was, but it has not fully secured their future either. The city has bought its residents time to decide what comes next. The uncomfortable question is whether that time will lead to lasting stability or just delay the next wave of hard choices. Number 3, Naples. Naples is often described as a place where money seems to solve everything. That is exactly why many people miss how deeply this city was affected after the new property tax changes were put in place. The shift did not show up on the surface. It showed up in how older residents began rethinking whether they could truly stay. For years, day-to-day expenses were not the main concern for retirees in Naples. Most had already settled into their lives. What unsettled them was the steady rise in property taxes tied to soaring home values, while their incomes barely moved. Many homeowners here are asset-rich but income fixed. Their homes kept appreciating, but their monthly cash flow did not, and that is when the sense of security started to crack. Before the new tax rules took effect, a quiet trend took hold. People sold their homes earlier than planned, not because they needed the money, but because the future felt unpredictable. Leaving while they still had control felt safer than waiting until decisions were forced on them. Naples did not push retirees out aggressively. It nudged them toward earlier exits. Once the new property tax adjustments kicked in, especially protections tied to primary residences, that pace slowed. Homeowners stopped rushing to sell. Conversations changed. Instead of asking, "Should we leave now?" people began saying, "Maybe we can wait a few more years." In a city like Naples, simply buying time is a meaningful transformation. But Naples also exposes the sharper edge of this policy. The relief works best for those who are already established, people who bought years ago and stayed put. New retirees arriving later do not receive the same level of protection. Renters hoping to buy face even steeper barriers. The law quietly drew a line between those already inside and those trying to get in. So Naples did not become cheaper after the tax changes. It became more stable for some and harder to access for others. Longtime residents gained peace of mind. The city preserved its community networks, health care systems, and senior services. At the same time, Naples became more selective in ways that are not immediately visible. That is the real transformation. Property tax reform here did not just ease financial pressure. It reshaped who can realistically stay long-term and who has to think twice. For longtime residents, the change brought reassurance. For those on the outside looking in, Naples may now feel like a safer place to grow old, but no longer an easy place to enter. And that quiet shift, more than any headline or statistic, is how Naples truly changed after the new property tax laws took effect. Number 4, Palm Bay. What if the reason people stop leaving is not because life suddenly got easier, but because leaving finally stopped feeling inevitable? That is the quiet question hanging over Palm Bay after the new property tax changes took effect. This is not a city that makes headlines. There are no luxury condos or postcard skylines here. But that is exactly why Palm Bay reveals something most people miss about how these tax laws are reshaping Florida. Palm Bay has long been home to older, working, and middle-class homeowners. Many bought modest houses decades ago. Mortgages are paid off. lifestyles are simple. For years, the biggest threat was not losing a job or missing a payment. It was the slow squeeze of rising property taxes layered on top of insurance and everyday costs. People did not panic. They endured until enduring started to feel like gambling. Before the tax changes, Palm Bay showed a pattern that rarely gets talked about. Residents did not move far. They moved down. Smaller homes, cheaper neighborhoods, sometimes just a few miles away. Others quietly sold and left Florida altogether, not because Palm Bay failed them, but because the math stopped working. Staying did not feel reckless yet, but it did not feel safe either. After the new property tax protections kicked in, especially those tied to primary residences and long-term ownership, that downward slide slowed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but noticeably. People stopped rushing into decisions they did not want to make. Homes stayed occupied longer. Conversations shifted from what if we have to sell to let us see how this plays out in Palm Bay. That pause is everything. Unlike wealthier cities, the impact here is not psychological comfort alone. It is practical survival. These tax adjustments did not create breathing room for luxuries. They created breathing room for basics, utilities, medical expenses, groceries. The difference between scraping by and staying steady. Palm Bay did not become more attractive. It became more livable for the people already there. But this is also where Palm Bay exposes a harder truth. The law stabilizes those who manage to hold on long enough to benefit. For residents who already sold or those renting with hopes of buying, the relief comes too late or not at all. The city is not changing evenly. It is settling into a new shape that favors endurance over opportunity. Palm Bay transformation is not about growth or reinvention. It is about resistance. The city resisted the quiet displacement that was hollowing out similar communities. It slowed a process that rarely gets noticed until it is too late. Neighborhoods did not turn over as fast. Familiar faces stayed. The social glue, neighbors checking in, informal support systems held a little longer. Number 5, St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg changed after the new property tax laws took effect, but not in a way that is immediately obvious. The city did not suddenly become cheaper. What mattered more was this. It stopped pushing older residents out as quickly as it used to. For years, retirees in St. Petersburg lived with a familiar feeling. The city kept growing. Homes kept getting more expensive, but their income stayed the same. Many had paid off their homes long ago. Mortgage was not the issue. The worry was the property tax bill creeping higher every year, while younger, wealthier newcomers moved in around them. The quiet fear was simple: I am being left behind. Before the new tax changes, many older homeowners sold earlier than they wanted to, not because they wanted to leave, but because waiting felt dangerous. Staying started to feel like a risk. And for someone living on a fixed income, that risk was hard to justify. After the new tax protections kicked in, especially for primary residences, the first thing that changed was not the market. It was a personal decision. People paused. They no longer felt forced to sell just to protect themselves. Staying stopped feeling reckless. For many, that alone was a major shift. Neighborhoods in St. Petersburg began to feel more stable. Longtime neighbors were still there. Familiar relationships did not disappear as quickly. The city stopped turning over all at once. Older residents gained time to live out their lives in the homes they knew. Instead of constantly preparing for the moment, they might have to leave. But St. Petersburg also reveals an uncomfortable truth. The new tax laws help people who already own homes for renters or those who arrived later hoping to buy. Finding a foothold is still difficult. In other words, the city is managing to hold onto its longtime residents, but it is not necessarily becoming easier to enter. For retirees watching closely, St. Petersburg sends a clear message. Property tax reform can help you stay longer, but it does not stop a city from changing. What it does is slow down how fast older residents are pushed out. Number 6, Tampa. Tampa did not change after the new property tax laws because it suddenly became easier to retire there. It changed because the pace at which older residents were being squeezed out finally slowed. In a city that has been growing fast and attracting younger workers, Tampa had quietly become a place where many retirees felt out of step with the future around them. For years, older homeowners in Tampa watched their neighborhoods transform. New developments went up, property values climbed, taxes followed. Many had paid off their homes long ago, but that did not protect them from rising annual costs on fixed incomes. Even modest increases felt heavy. Staying did not feel impossible yet, but it felt less certain every year. Before the tax changes, retirees in Tampa often talked about getting ahead of the problem. That meant selling earlier than planned. Downsizing or moving farther out where taxes were lower. These were not emotional decisions. They were defensive ones. people did not want to wait until staying became unaffordable. After the new property tax protections began to take effect, especially those tied to primary residences, that urgency eased, not dramatically but noticeably. Older residents felt they could wait. They did not have to rush into decisions they were not ready for. For many, that shift from pressure to pause was the real impact of the law. Tampa transformation is different from places like Sarasota or Cape Coral. This is not a city centered around retirees. It is a mixed city, balancing growth, jobs, and new residents. The tax changes did not stop Tampa from evolving. What they did was give longtime homeowners a little more time to keep up. That extra time matters. It means fewer forced exits, fewer sudden moves, more stability for people who spent decades building their lives here. But it also highlights a limit. Tampa remains competitive and expensive for newcomers and renters. The relief mainly helps those already inside the system. Number 7, Miami. What happens when a new property tax law gives you relief on paper, but daily life still keeps getting more expensive? That question sits at the heart of Miami after the latest property tax changes were put in place. And for many older residents, the answer is uncomfortable. Miami did not transform the way quieter Florida cities did. Here, the new tax rules did not suddenly make retirement easier or restore a sense of long-term security. Instead, they exposed just how uneven the playing field already was in a city shaped by global wealth. Fast-moving real estate and relentless cost increases. Tax relief landed softly, and for many seniors, not nearly deep enough. For longtime homeowners, the pressure was never just about the mortgage. Most had paid that off years ago. The real strain came from everything stacked on top of it. Rising property taxes tied to soaring home values, insurance premiums that jumped year after year, HOA fees and everyday expenses that never seemed to slow down. Living on a fixed income in Miami meant constantly adjusting, constantly cutting, constantly recalculating how long staying was still possible. When the new property tax protections took effect, some older homeowners did feel a slight easing. The fear of a sudden tax spike softened, but unlike cities such as Sarasota or Cape Coral, that relief did not change the overall equation. In Miami, costs do not rise one at a time. Even if taxes level off, insurance climbs, assessments appear. The market keeps pushing forward. For many retirees, the feeling did not shift to safety. It shifted to delay. That is why Miami's response was hesitation, not commitment. There were not mass sell-offs, but there was not renewed confidence either. People waited, they watched, they held on, knowing the law bought time but not certainty. Staying no longer felt immediately reckless, but it still did not feel secure. Miami also makes one reality impossible to ignore. Property tax reform works best where taxes are the main problem. In Miami, they are only one piece of a much heavier burden. Renters saw almost no benefit. New retirees arriving later found few protections. Even longtime homeowners realized that tax relief alone cannot hold back a city that keeps getting more expensive from every direction. Number 8, Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale did not suddenly become easier to retire in after the new property tax laws took effect. What changed was more restrained and more revealing. The pressure eased slightly, but the underlying squeeze never fully let go. For many older homeowners, the tax adjustments helped smooth out one fear: sudden spikes in property taxes tied to rising home values. That mattered. It reduced panic selling and gave some retirees room to pause. But Fort Lauderdale is a city where costs rarely move in isolation, even as property taxes stabilized. Insurance premiums continued climbing, condo fees rose, and everyday expenses stayed high. For seniors on fixed incomes, relief in one area was quickly offset in another. Before the law, many retirees felt they were being nudged toward the exit without anyone saying it out loud. After the law, that nudge softened, but it did not disappear. People did not rush to sell, but few felt confident enough to fully settle in for the long term. Staying felt possible, but still conditional. Number 9, Orlando. Orlando change after the new property tax laws was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle and for many older residents, easy to miss. The city did not become a safer place to retire. It became a place where decisions could be delayed, but not avoided. For retirees in Orlando, property taxes were never the only pressure. Tourism-driven growth pushed up home values, insurance costs, and everyday prices all at once. Many longtime homeowners had paid off their houses, yet still felt squeezed year after year. Before the tax changes, staying often felt like a temporary choice, something to reassess every budget cycle. When the new tax protections took effect, especially for primary residences, they softened one edge of that pressure. Sudden tax jumps became less frightening. Some older residents stopped rushing into early sales. That pause mattered. It gave people space to think rather than react, but Orlando problem runs deeper. This is a city built around constant turnover, workers, renters, short-term residents. The tax relief helped those who already owned homes, but it did not slow the broader cost of living. For many retirees, the feeling shifted from "I need to leave now" to "I will wait and see." That is Orlando transformation. Not stability, not security, just time. And in a city that keeps moving fast, time is helpful, but it is not the same as feeling safe enough to stay for good. Number 10, Jacksonville. Jacksonville did not experience a dramatic shift after the new property tax laws took effect. Instead, the change showed up in a quieter way. The city became more manageable to stay in, but not necessarily easier to retire in. For many older homeowners, Jacksonville had always felt like a practical choice. Homes were relatively affordable, neighborhoods were spread out, and life moved at a slower pace than in South Florida. Still, rising property taxes added pressure year after year, even for people who had paid off their homes long ago. On fixed incomes, predictability mattered more than savings. After the tax adjustments, that predictability improved. Sudden jumps in property taxes became less likely, and some retirees felt comfortable delaying plans to downsize or relocate. The law did not change lifestyles overnight, but it reduced the feeling that staying put was risky. However, Jacksonville's broader reality did not shift much. Insurance costs continued to rise, and everyday expenses still crept upward. The tax relief helped longtime homeowners most, while renters and newer residents saw little benefit. As a result, Jacksonville did not transform into a retirement haven. It simply became less stressful for those already settled. Looking across these 10 cities, one thing becomes clear. The new property tax laws did not create miracles, but they are redrawing the line between places where older residents can stay and places where they are quietly being pushed to plan an exit. In some cities, people gain time and a sense of security to grow old in the homes they already own. In others, the relief is only temporary, and the question, "How much longer can I hold on?" still lingers. If you live in Florida, own a home, or are thinking about retirement in the years ahead, this is not a story to hear once and forget. Tap like and subscribe to Tax Hack Pro as we continue tracking the quiet but very real changes shaping housing, taxes, and retirement life, so you're not caught off guard when the rules shift again. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video until the end. If you found this content helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss our daily video updates. Now feel free to explore other exciting videos currently shown on your screen. Goodbye and see you in the next.